Morning. Welcome to today's CBI coronavirus webinar. My name is Kerry Thomas. I'm an editor at a new startup called Tortoise, and it's a great pleasure, as ever, to be doing these calls every day with the CBI. Yesterday, I think nearly all of you on the call will know, was a back to work day in a certain sense. It was the day when the Prime Minister had said in his address on Sunday that if you can go back to work safely, then you should. But as we all know, because we've been talking about it for the last few weeks, an awful lot hinges on that word safely. And I think we don't yet know what the effect of the Prime Minister's words were, whether it had any tangible effect on the numbers of people going back to work. But I think it just adds to that sense of these questions moving from the hypothetical to the very real now, which is why it's a great pleasure to have with us today two people who are right at the centre of conversation about these measures. We've got as guest speakers we'll be coming to later Sarah Alban, who's the Chief Executive of the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive. Sarah, it's terrific, really kind of you to make the time to be on this call today when you must be frantically busy. And we've also got, I'm sure, equally busy Ed Bowyer, who is a Senior Employment Partner at Hogan Lovells. So we'll come to Sarah and Ed in a little while, but I think as everybody knows, we first of all run round some recent developments with somebody from the CBI, and we'll do that with Matthew Fell in a second. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get there. As ever, this is really about the questions that you send in. I suspect we're going to get an awful lot today. They've started coming in already, and we'll try and incorporate as many of those as we can. If we don't get to them in this call, they're not wasted. The CBI has a team of people who pick them up in the course of the day, and we'll get back to you as quickly as they possibly can. Somewhere on your screen, to submit a question, there'll be a button that says question. Do press that, fire one in. If you wanted to be anonymous, then just write anon in the subject line, and we will respect that, of course. And you can, of course, send in questions any time of day or night to the CBI through the usual email, coronavirussupport@cbi.org.uk. But I think we're going to have a busy one, so let's get going. Matthew, good morning.
Good morning. Hi, everyone.
Let's do what we always do and just remind ourselves what some of the key developments have been in the last day or two. What have you been looking at?
Yeah, thanks, Kerry. I think two or three things on our mind, really. First, a few bits where we've got some welcome and encouraging developments in terms of the government support. First, we had a couple of days ago, very significant announcement from the Chancellor that the job retention scheme, probably the single most important intervention from the government, that has been extended quite significantly through to the end of July in full in its current form, and then through to the end of October in a slightly more flexible form. My sense is we've probably got a couple of weeks to shape exactly what that flexibility looks like. We know the Chancellor said there is an expectation that the employer and the business side will do more cost sharing from August onwards, and we'll need to work out exactly what that looks like. And then secondly, really importantly, it would be great to get insights and comment from people either on this webinar or on follow-up. What actually are the examples of the flexibility that will most help businesses get back to work as demand begins to ramp up? So we're keen to shape and understand what that flexibility looks like. So that's on the job retention scheme. Second, I think breaking news, as Carolyn was doing this webinar yesterday morning, we had a really helpful announcement around trade credit insurance. It sounds like quite a technical and a niche thing, but as we've discussed previously, so important to making sure that supply chains continue to flow effectively. And the government have said they will step in and provide temporary reinsurance agreement to help make this continue to work. Again, we're still working on the details of that, but I think the idea and the intention is that will be up and running and in place by the end of this month, so really quite rapidly now. And then the third issue, Kerry, I thought I'd just mention is less on the government support side of things, but an issue that we feel has been really bubbling up and rising up the agenda in recent days, which is around transport. We'll probably touch on that in a little bit more detail as we get into the thick of this conversation today, but I think a couple of aspects on this that people are really starting to get their heads around now. One is, as we do get back to work and more people do start to come into the workplace, how do we sort of approach and manage this very, very significant drop in capacity around public transport for those people that are reliant on that for getting to their place of work? We know, and we talked last week, really significant drops off in the capacity around that. And then the other issue is this piece that's been in the news around the 14-day quarantine around people coming into the country from overseas and so on, and making sure that, of course, you have to be guided by the medical and the science advice behind that, but to understand, is that the most effective way of doing that? Because it's not just an issue for the aviation sector, but we're hearing from so many businesses right across the economy, from people and professionals and support people in businesses trying to get in and out and provide their specialist services in a short space of time, through to the tourism sector. It just has a ripple right across the whole economy. So a really significant issue there brewing as well.
Okay, let me just go back to one thing you mentioned on the JRS, Matthew, the question of the employer contribution, which I think we're going to get clarity on at the end of this month from the Chancellor. I talked yesterday to a couple of employers who are quite worried about where that's going to land, and not sure whether that figure is very much in play, or whether the Chancellor has got in mind something like the 20% that you might have inferred from things he's previously said. Is that a big open discussion, or should we expect something in the region of 20%, do you think?
Yeah, I think my sense, Kerry, is that is still up for grabs as a conversation. I think what the Chancellor has said is employees will continue to receive as a minimum 80% of their full pay if they are furloughed, and there is an expectation that the government contribution to that will be both lower, and the employer has to make it up to at least 80%. Many businesses who've used the furlough scheme, of course, to date have been topping up to the full 100% to make good the sort of employees' full salary to date, and they've been very much doing that where they've been in a position to be able to do so. So I think that is the change that will come. But my sense is both that aspect of the contribution will need to work through, and it may be that there'll be some businesses and some sectors, for example, who are likely to remain more closed for a longer period of time than many that are starting to think about restart and reopening. And that is one of the things I think that we will need to work through in the coming weeks is the JRS, the Job Retention Scheme, the most helpful and beneficial support mechanism for those type of businesses who are largely still closed, or is something else better suited to them, and we flex the JRS for those companies that are starting to see demand coming back and where they open. So that's what we're going to be working on in the coming weeks.
Right, okay, thanks for that. Let's turn a bit more closely to the business of the day. Matthew, what are you starting to hear from employers about compliance and enforcement on the return to work, on things like risk assessments, PPE, all those kinds of issues?
Yeah, well, I think clearly at the start of this week, we did really helpfully see the safer working guidance published, and that really gave companies something to sort of start working towards, to say, when I reopen, what are the steps, what are the measures that I am going to need to put in place? I'm sure people have had a chance to digest this quite a bit now, but just to recap, we know that there are 8 separate pieces of guidance depending on what is the sort of nature of business. They're organized by type of work. So if you're working outdoors, if you're in a factory or a warehouse, if you're working in an office, clearly the guidance will be different for those different types of setups. But each of those does have those things you mentioned, Kerry. So there is a risk assessment, which importantly, companies employing over 50 people are expected to publish, so that we can see transparently the measures and the steps that have been assessed and put in place. It covers things like what is the appropriate steps to take around social distancing at work, how you should go about managing your workforce so we get the sort of peaks and flows and so on across. And I think overall the reaction from business has been pretty positive to this. I think people have liked the fact it follows the principle that we set out around sort of flexibility within a framework. So you know roughly the parameters about what you have to do, but equally we know every single business is different and a little bit nuanced, so it has that room for flexibility. I think people have been encouraged that it builds on the guidance and also the sort of the innovative and good practices they've put in place. So particularly for those businesses who've largely stayed open for the duration and have adapted how they worked and what that setup is, it sort of builds on that. And there's plenty of practical examples and illustrations in there. But of course, what it does do is transfer the responsibility to businesses and the individuals. It sort of shifts from telling you this is what you must do to your interpretation of those guidelines. That's the trade-off with the flexibility, essentially. And I think, Kerry, there are 3 areas in particular where we're seeing sort of more questions and follow-up coming through on as people begin to digest this over the course of this week. First bucket is around compliance and enforcement. Lots of people saying, just legally, where do I stand on this guidance? What's a sort of must do versus a best endeavors style approach? I think also people are keen to work out, what do I need to publish in the risk assessment? What level of detail do I need to get into? It'd be great to get views from both Sarah and Ed on this. I think people are alive to the fact that probably the litigation risk around health and safety, real or perceived, but they sense that is on the increase. So how do I stay the right side of the line on that? And also, if I've got any sort of disputes, either inconsistent enforcement or a disagreement with employers, who do I contact in the event of those disputes and so on? So there's a lot around compliance and enforcement, and then further issues around PPE, schools, transport, and so on that we'll get stuck into. Kerry, you've gone a little bit, you're quiet. I think we can't hear you at the moment. Very good. You're back.
I lost you there for a minute, Matthew, or you lost me, fogging the channel one way or the other. I can't quite tell. Sarah, can I come to you?
Yeah.
Good morning, and thanks for doing this again. Let me just begin. My sort of amateur impression of the HSE is that it's an organisation that it's probably well understood in some sectors, but maybe more feared than understood in other places. Can you just sort of fill us in on what your role is in framing the sort of discussion and the legislation around coronavirus and the measures that employers have to take, and then in enforcement afterwards?
Sure. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I guess the HSE has got actually a very wide remit. I don't know quite where the webinar is going out to, but we cover Scotland, England, and Wales. There's a separate body in Northern Ireland, although we work very closely with them. Devolution is a complicated thing. It's probably easier to just say we cover those three countries and not Northern Ireland. There are some wrinkles around what we do. And I guess if people know us at all, they probably do know us about the sort of, the health and safety inspector coming originally from the old sort of Factories Act, and somebody who sort of comes around and says, what are you doing right? What are you doing wrong? And of course, we do have a workforce that does some of that. Enforcement is split between us and local authorities. Again, you can that's all set out in regulation. I have to say they're quite complicated, but broadly we take the high hazard sites, so oil wells, refineries, factories, farms, and the lower hazard, of many of which will be very interested actually in the light of coronavirus, often fall to the local authorities. So a lot of leisure, a lot of retail would be in local authority hands. For employees or anybody wondering, you've got a legal obligation to stick a poster up in your place of work, which would say who your actual enforcement body is. So I always say to people, just look at that. It's probably easier than sort of picking your way through the regs and trying to work it out. But we're very used to getting calls from people who aren't too sure, and we'll point people in the right direction anyway. There are a couple of other things that are relevant with the supervising authority, market supervising authority for PPE. So under a current derogation from Europe, no longer requiring everything to be CE marked, it's my team that will look at the non-CE marked PPE coming into the country or being produced in the country and say this doesn't meet standards. We're also the chemicals regulation authority for the Great Britain. So we're the ones who agree or don't the use of biocides, pesticides, various chemicals, and crucially in coronavirus, that's involved us both taking out of the market unsafe hand sanitizers and approving the use of various hand sanitizers in this. And then finally, we have a big science division. So we've been doing a lot of testing on different equipment to bring it in or not, and to look at some of the evidence. In normal times, we're spending quite a lot of time thinking about how to green business and how to, say, use hydrogen in the economy. But we've been very much all about coronavirus, as I guess as everybody else, for the last few weeks and months.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for that. Ed, before we've got a load, I think we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about risk assessments. I can see from the questions that are coming in already that there's a very high level of interest in those. But before we get into those, Ed, a more general question. We know just from looking and listening around that a lot of employers are worried that they could find themselves accidentally on the wrong side of the law through this coronavirus crisis and their response to it. How worried should they be?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think whether worried is the word, it is something that all employers have to take extremely seriously, because the consequences of not doing that couldn't be any worse than they are, as we know. So as Matthew said, all employers now have a huge responsibility to their staff to be taking this very, very seriously, and also to society, I think, more widely. And we know that employers are under obligations to consult under the health and safety rules, and indeed under the guidance about the return to work and what that looks like. And that's not straightforward. And there are bound to be lots of very different, tricky issues in each set of companies for each employer. And I think employers have to take that immensely seriously and put a lot of very careful time and thinking into the process of the return to work. Because if they don't do that, then there are clearly going to be legal risks and cultural risks for staff, and health risks, of course, more seriously. So yes, I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I'd say it's the biggest issue I think that employers have had to grapple with in that time.
Right. Okay. Let's turn directly to the question of risk assessments, because certainly the majority of the early questions that are coming in, Sarah, touch on those. And people are looking to understand what sort of level of detail might be required in a good risk assessment. Is there anything in general terms that you can say usefully about what sort of detail you might be looking for?
So I think it's important just to remind everybody that you were already under a legal obligation to do a risk assessment for health and safety risks. And so the guidance hasn't introduced a new requirement. And if you look at your existing risk assessment for the pre-existing health and safety risks, that should give you a good sense of the level of detail that you've been currently dealing with and that you should expect to sort of now think about coronavirus. And so definitely what we're looking for is, if you like, thinking about coronavirus as a new risk in the context of all the other risks you're managing, because you know, this should neither be the only thing you think about, or indeed just that you forget about all the other pre-existing risks. And for some things, think about lifting a heavy load. You may well have had in your risk assessment, well, this is quite heavy, so 2 people should lift it. If it was only very marginally too heavy, you might now look at that again and go, well, actually, better that 1 person lifts it and 2 people don't come into contact. So there's all of those things you need to think about in the kind of overall context of the risk in your particular workplace. But in general, I think, you know, we encourage you to think about work as a system rather than a series of individual tasks. So, and we have put online a toolkit to help you sort of just think through risk systematically. So encourage people to have a look at that, because I think it'll just help you sort of think through what are the kind of things you need to be thinking about, whether that's your people arriving at the office, how they might move through the office, what their kind of arrangement looks like, whether it be in a office space or in a factory, how often they might meet, thinking about non-work activity that still takes place within the work environment. So what about when they go to the canteen for a coffee? Have you organised the queuing there, the seating there? So it just helps you really think about your people as they pass through their different activities within your control during the day, and how you'll look after them, and of course any other customers that you come into contact with.
Right, that's really useful, Sarah. Thank you, Ed. That's the question of what goes in it. I suppose there's also the question of how you do it. Is this something that an employer should sit in a corner, put a towel over his or her head, and knock out on their own, or how important is consultation? How important is talking to employees as part of putting together a good risk assessment?
I think talking to employees and getting their input is definitely going to be important. Plenty of clients are also talking to health and safety experts, external parties who have the professional view. So yeah, absolutely key. And I think if you can say that we've gone out, we've spoken to staff, we've listened, we've reacted to concerns, then that is going to go down very well with your staff, and it's also going to mitigate the risk of any claims.
Kerry, could I just amplify that? I mean, I think Ed completely spot on. I think firstly that requirement to sort of consult is absolutely there. So you should do that with a representative, either through a sort of recognised trade union or by the workforce. So it's a required bit of that risk assessment. But also, I would say, even more go beyond that. I think employees are probably the best place to identify how do you adopt certain practices to put in place the sort of social distancing and so on. And then the extra things I would say are, there is probably in this current climate sort of heightened uncertainty and nervousness and so on. So absolutely be sort of sensitive to any yaps, either sort of perceived or real, in terms of the measures that are being put in place. And my final thought on this would be, don't make it a sort of one-off exercise. Look, we're learning all the time as we go through on this, and people will identify new and evolving things. So don't do it as just a one-off task as you're putting in place a risk assessment. Keep communicating would be the thought there.
And to just sort of jump in, of course, I'm sure many of your of people watching today have already got well-established methods for talking to and consulting with their employees. But for any of you who might need a bit more help, we do also have a talking toolkit freely available on the web, which will help people sort of run through that. As both Ed and Matthew have said, I think talking to your employees is really important. And the other aspect is that it's not just you that have got an obligation. Your employees are also under an obligation to actually do the things that you need them to do. And if by having that proper consultation, they understand the safety that you're trying to put in place, they understand why things are important, they're much more likely to comply with your risk assessment and do the things that you want them to do to keep your company safe and to keep them safe as well.
Yeah. Let me stay with you, Sarah, because we've had a question that you've touched on a little bit before, but a question that says, how should businesses be approaching risk assessments if they have operations across the whole of the UK, given the slightly different approach to ending lockdown that we're seeing being taken in the devolved administrations?
So I think, I mean, in a sense, as an employer ourselves, we're grappling with that because we've got offices in Scotland and Wales, and so I really understand the sort of the complexity of slightly different rules in the slightly different jurisdictions in the UK. But I suppose the thing to think about is the risks are the same. Coronavirus doesn't respect borders, doesn't think, well, I'm a virus in Scotland, how should I be? I'm a virus in England. So the risks are the same. The issue is about the permissions and what you're allowed to do. So what I would say is think about the risks almost irrespective of, are you allowed to be open yet? Can you conduct this piece of business yet? And then respect the local guidance and the local laws about the pace at which you open and the kind of business that you bring back. But it isn't going to impact the risk. It just impacts the starting time and the what you can do, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah, thanks. We've also had I'll stay with you just for one more, Sarah, if I may, a question in about whether any redactions are allowed in risk assessments for GDPR requirements, security, those kinds of things. Is that permissible?
I think it would suggest, if you're worrying about that you're going down to too low a level. I mean, so if you're thinking about, and Fred is a nightmare because we know that he will do X, Y, Z, probably just don't put that in your risk assessment.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It would be to have personal data in a risk assessment that's published on a website. I think that would be extremely risky and not the right thing to do.
Yeah. Okay. We've had a couple of questions in about what will amount to reasonable measures, reasonable precautions. One in particular that says, as the guidance is that business must take reasonable measures to ensure social distancing and so on, would the HSE be prepared to issue a confirmation that business actions were in accordance with that threshold, with the sense of a reasonable action? Is that possible, Sarah?
Well, I suppose the actual legislation requires employers to do what is reasonably practicable, and Ed may want to say some more about that. But that means you can look at what you can do and can't do. You don't have to do everything. If we had to create a world in which there was no risk at all, then nobody would ever do anything. And some businesses are inherently higher risk. I mentioned the fact we work with oil refineries, offshore oil. Clearly, if you absolutely don't want those things to ever end catastrophically, you just have to never do them because it's a very, very low probability. But if things go wrong, they go badly wrong. In terms of us certifying, I think the trouble is that we don't understand your business in the same way that you understand your business. I think if you wanted to sort of approach us to talk in general terms about what you were wanting to do, to show us the risk assessment, we're really happy to do that, happy to provide the help we can. But at the end of the day, risk is also a dynamic thing that you need to keep sort of responding to. As the situation changes, the risk may change and you need to respond to that. So to some extent, it's only as good as the moment you write it down, and you need to keep thinking about it.
Yeah, but I suppose, Ed, from your point of view, or from the point of view of the employers that you work with, a lot of the risks that they're dealing with year in and year out are relatively known, and this is a relatively unknown. So that's probably why we're getting these questions in about what will be seen as reasonable. Is there anything you can say from a legal perspective about that?
Yes, I think there's a bit of a lawyer's answer, but what's reasonable is always fact specific. So you need to look at the situation on the ground and say, well, in this particular situation, what can we do as an employer? And I think employers are going to need to be very, very flexible and quite creative in the way that they're addressing issues. So you will have, all employers will have a different group of people with different concerns. There may be female workers who are pregnant. Now, what's reasonable for them is going to be slightly different to a male who isn't pregnant. You may have an employee with mental health issues who has a very severe difficulty of commuting. So what's reasonable for that individual is going to be different to someone who's happy to jump on a bike and cycle to work. So I think flexibility is going to be key. Creative thinking is going to be key. We know from the discrimination legislation that cost, saying this is all very expensive, therefore it's not reasonable, that doesn't work. That is not a good defence. So employers will be expected to spend money on making these reasonable adjustments, and they are reasonable if they work. That's an obvious point, but if someone says, well, how about this, and it doesn't actually meet the kind of end requirement, then it is unlikely to be reasonable. But I think they need to be flexible, and they need to be thinking outside the box than they have done previously. And where employees are not happy to come to work, there are a whole bunch of issues that employees can think about before they get to the point where they say, well, we're not going to pay you, or we're going to discipline you. And we can get into that now, or we can come on to it, because I know you've got questions around that.
Well, let's get into it now, because actually we've got quite a few questions that have come in that say, all right, so we've consulted, we've taken reasonable precautions, but we've still run out of road with a particular employee. What might our options be? What would your advice be in those kind of situations, Ed?
Well, I suppose it does depend on what we mean when we say we've run out of road, because there are, I mean, obvious point, if they can work from home, they should be working from home if they're not happy to come into the office. If they can't do that, then is there something different they can do in the office? Can they have a special place in the office that's safer? Can they work different hours? Can they avoid the busy commute? Can you line up some other form of transportation for them? So really thinking around the box on that. If they're still not happy to come into work and they still can't work at home, is there a different role you could give them? Could they do something from home that's entirely different for the next few months? If the answer to that is no, can you look at furlough? Lots of employers are, a number aren't, on a principal reason. Can you look at holiday and say, okay, well, for the next 3 weeks, you take some paid holiday, so financially you're secure? Or can you look at unpaid leave? So there is a whole kind of triage system, I think, that employers can look at before they get to that point where they say, well, now you are not responding to a reasonable management request to come to work, therefore we're not going to pay you, and worse still, we're going to discipline you. And I think the vast majority of employers are going to be very, very keen to avoid disciplinaries and to avoid kind of difficult confrontational situations with employees who are genuinely nervous.
Kerry, just to jump in, if I may, I think everything that Ed's just said, I made the point, you know, one of the big themes that's come through over the course of this week for us is sort of asking about how does this safer working guidance, what's the interplay look like with the situation with schools and indeed public transport. And I think, you know, just to sort of really reinforce everything that Ed has just said, I think is super helpful in terms of helping companies work out how do you address those situations whereby either for ongoing school closures, depending on the age of a child, or particularly around public transport, if that is the only mode by which people can get into work. So people, for very good reasons, are saying either I can't or I won't come to work. I think, you know, that decision tree and triaging that Ed has just talked through, it's sort of super helpful in those situations as well.
Great. Okay, Sarah, we've had quite a few questions coming in about the provision of PPE and the circumstances in which some sort of face covering, or that level of PPE might be required. I think we can all imagine workplaces where it's essential, in care homes or wherever. But would you anticipate that that employers who, for example, are bringing staff back into an enclosed office, might they have to think about the provision of face coverings for their staff in that kind of environment?
I think generally not. And if you read the guidance, it's really clear on this. The Public Health England have been the ones who are providing us at HSE and also the wider governmental advice on PPE. And we've been really at pains to try to distinguish face coverings from PPE. There are a certain number of settings where PPE for coronavirus is appropriate. And as you mentioned them there, Kerry, it's principally obviously in clinical settings, care homes, hospitals, but also some other first responder, people working in the prison service may also find it appropriate. But in general, the strong advice from Public Health England is that social distancing and in particular scrupulous hygiene are the best methods of risk mitigation against coronavirus. So you really want to be thinking about how you stop people from being too close to each other, certainly for long periods of time. And there is an interplay between length of time and distance. So just walking past somebody on the way to the coffee point, probably not really much of a problem. Hanging around chatting at the coffee point starts being much more problematic. You will need to really think about what do your hand hygiene look like. We're thinking for our own offices, what about door pulls where they don't have full automatic opening? How do we stop surfaces from being touched? Have we been over keen on sort of, little number pads to get into particular areas? Do we really need that? And all of those kind of sort of high contact points, how are you cleaning those? How are you reminding staff every time they touch something like that to clean those? Face coverings, if you read the guidance, it says there is no evidence at all that will provide any protection for the individual wearing the covering. So it's of no benefit, say Public Health England, for the person wearing the covering. There is some weak evidence that it will be of limited benefit, and this is what the government guidance is based on for people in public transport, from protecting other people from you if you have coronavirus. I think in the employment situation, it's first really important to say, if you've got people who are suspected of having coronavirus, you absolutely should not have them in the workplace. And it's really important that your sort of systems of work, say anybody symptomatic needs to just go home and stay home and self-isolate. There is a small risk of transmission from asymptomatic people, and this is where you get down to the very marginal benefit of face covering. But our concern would be there's no standard for face covering. What does an adequate covering look like? The protection is very, very limited. There are actually risks associated potentially with wearing one if you don't wear one well. So what the guidance says is, if your employees choose to wear one of their own in the workplace and you're happy to support that, what you need to do is to think about reminding them they must wash their hands before and be clean before they put it on. They must not touch the covering all the time they're wearing it. And when they take it off, they need to put it in a plastic bag and wash their hands again. And that's much more important. So I would think it's very unlikely that anybody would start putting that into their risk assessment. And there's other PPE, of course, that is really important if you're working in a dusty environment, if you're working in various other industrial areas where PPE is normal, then absolutely you need to think about continuing to be able to provide that. We recognise that PPE might be in short supply, but if it is and if it's required and you've got no other mitigation, then you'll have to not do that activity until you can get that appropriate PPE for the practice that it's normally available for.
Right. You've touched a bit on this, Sarah, but let me stay with you because we've had a few questions in about social distancing, particularly in relatively small office spaces. People asking whether you see a role for the HSE in enforcing social distancing in those kind of settings. Do you?
Well, we don't. We haven't got new powers. There's no sort of specific law now been passed about how many meters you must be apart from each other. So we're not going to be turning into the social distancing police. But there are powers, obviously under the Health and Safety at Work Act, to enforce in a space if the employer's risk assessment is either inadequate or they're inadequately following it. So it is possible, and we've spoken to various businesses, and I think we have issued a few improvement notices actually to a small number of businesses to think better about their social distancing. An improvement notice gives you a legal obligation to make the improvement described, and potentially we could and would prosecute if people just ignore that. But the thrust of where we prefer to work is to work with businesses to help them think through the risks that are present and make the relevant improvements. And we'd always start off in a kind of an advisory head-on before we get into enforcement and sort of wielding a big stick. And our experience so far overwhelmingly in this is that employers are taking it super seriously. If they're not doing the right thing, it's mostly because they weren't too sure what to do. And our inspectors have been able to help them think about their systems of work, think about their ways of working and make improvements. And as I say, overwhelmingly, we've seen firms that are only too willing to do that.
Right. Ed, let me turn to you because we've had a couple of questions on people sort of mulling over how they act legally and safely from their perspective in managing their staff's return to work. So we've had one question in from someone who's trying to oversee a return to work in the early stages, beginning with staff who are happy to come back, and wondering about the rights and wrongs of asking people who are returning to sign a declaration saying that they've accepted the risk of returning. Does that seem like a good idea to you? I can see Sarah shaking.
It's an interesting one. We've seen a few clients doing that. Clearly, you don't have to do it. There's no law that says you do it. If you do get that declaration, that is not a silver bullet for an employer to sit back and think, "No, I'm fine now because I've essentially got a waiver." So to take an extreme situation, you could have an employer that does nothing in terms of making all those adjustments and making the workplace safe, get someone to sign a declaration saying, "Yeah, I'm happy to come back and I waive my rights." That wouldn't stand up in a court. So some are doing it. I suppose you question why they're doing it, given they don't have to. And I think the key, rather than getting a declaration, is to really work hard on the consultation and work hard on making the workplace a safe place to be, and really thinking who needs to be coming back to work in these early days, rather than just saying you can all come back. It's actually what's business critical here. If people could work from home, they should. And then going through your different categories of staff and thinking, well, who are the priority people here? And that may be categories of people who find it particularly difficult to work at home. They don't have the equipment, or again, they could have mental health issues that make it hard for them to be cooped up in a house and easier for them to be back at work. So I think it's an interesting one, the declaration and the waiver. Many are doing it. You don't have to, and I don't think it gives you legal security. I don't think it mitigates your risk hugely, because the devil will be in the detail as to what you do on the ground.
And Carrie, just to
jump.
Go on, Sarah. You go.
Sarah first, and then you, Matthew.
Well, I was just going to jump in and say that I would certainly defer to Ed on any kind of personal injury aspects, but in terms of carrying out a proper risk assessment and doing all that is reasonably practical to keep your employees safe under Health and Safety at Work Act, ultimately failure to do that is a criminal offence, and there's no such thing as informed consent to that. So you certainly can't get out from under the obligations in the Health and Safety at Work Act through consent.
Yeah, Matthew?
Well, I was just going to actually add, it feels to me, if you're sort of going down the road of a sort of transactional approach to this with people, that's actually just doing nothing to sort of build engagement and confidence. And actually all the sort of adjustment measures that every business is thinking about and rightly putting in place at the moment, actually those adjustments only really work if employees really buy into it and sort of believe in the measures that you're doing. And actually that is about engagement rather than that sort of transactional approach of signing a document or a waiver.
Yeah. Okay. Ed, we've had an interesting question that's come in about sickness, which sort of builds on something that Sarah said earlier. So I might come to you as well, Sarah, here, which is whether companies should be rewriting their sickness policies to encourage people who have any kind of cold type symptoms. We know that COVID symptoms can be, widely varying. Should companies be rewriting their sickness procedures so that those people do stay at home who should stay at home, and it doesn't impact on their sickness record?
That is a very interesting question. I haven't seen that happen yet in practice. I think what employers are focusing on at the moment is getting the messaging very, very clear as to what staff should do if they are feeling unwell, if they are showing us symptoms. And that isn't rewriting a policy that lives in a handbook somewhere. It is upfront, clear, unambiguous messaging to staff so that they know exactly what to do and when. And I think that's the most important thing. Whether employers then want to rewrite policies later on to say that sickness due to COVID type reasons or due to an employer taking a very cautious view and sending people home shouldn't impact on their sickness record, I think is a point for discussion. But clearly, if someone is sent home because they're sick or because they've got symptoms, that is not something that should ever be used against them in a way that could have a negative effect. So, for example, if, and it is going to be an issue, unfortunately, in the coming months, employers are looking at redundancies and they're looking at redundancy selection criteria, then clearly it would be deeply unfair to use sickness absence as a relevant criteria where an employer has taken a certain stance to send people home. So generally speaking, sickness absence shouldn't ever be used as a criteria anyway, because it could lead to disability discrimination issues. But I just think they need to be mindful of that point.
Yeah. Matthew, that does seem quite an interesting thought, doesn't it? That our sort of personal risk assessment as we relate to other people it needs to change through this. That, we all know people who will struggle into work through all kinds of, sickness. And how we discourage that from happening seems, quite an interesting notion.
Yeah, my sense, Kerry, even just from the sort of environments and offices and colleagues that I interact with, both at the CBI, but then the many other businesses that we work with, I almost sort of feel that change in approach is sort of happening anyway, even before this current crisis. I think, if people were the attitudes have changed from the idea of sort of struggling in regardless to actually that genuine encouragement to stay away, and I think that's coming from people as individuals as much as it is a sort of management directive or diktat sort of thing. I think people are saying, actually, to be honest, value my own health and well-being, and if that means you not being around for a few days and risk of me catching whatever, so much the better, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Look, I'm afraid it's flown by, but we are now out of time. It's 1:45 or just coming up to. So just time for me to say that on tomorrow's webinar, we have got Carolyn Fairburn and Josh Hardy, just looking back over the range of developments this week, of which there have been many. So do join us at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning for that. Let me thank Ed. Let me thank Sarah. Let me thank Matthew as ever. And we hope to see you tomorrow.